Hey everyone, it is week 11, um, and unfortunately, I do not have I didn't bring my webcam home with me before recording this. Just completely forgot and left it at school, and I can't stand the webcam that's actually on, like, built into my laptop. So unfortunately, you're gonna have to go without my video of my face up in the corner. I'm sorry about that. However, I did discover while playing around how to speed up the footage of my videos without changing the pitch of my voice. And as such, I realize now I can make these videos a bit shorter. Surely you are familiar with by now with how I can sort of pause and stumble and stammer as I talk, have moments where I need to pause and think about what I'm going to say next and things of that nature. And sometimes the length of these videos is purely just because of that. So you may notice that I'm speaking a little bit faster in this particular video, in the videos this week in particular. I'm giving it a try. If you guys tell me that you don't like it, I won't do it again. But I'm giving it a try this week. We'll see how this goes. Anyway, as you can see here, we are going to talk about the shift from Romanticism to Realism. And you need to have read in the textbook, The History of Western Society, Chapter 22, Life in the Emergent Urban Society. I want you to note that when you read that chapter, it's going to be giving you the history. It's going to be giving you the historical context to what's going on. I'm mainly going to talk about the art today in this particular lecture, but there very well could be a quiz question or two that comes from the reading and the reading alone. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in.
So the first thing I want to do is give you a few terms that are important that come into play here. First off, realism. Right, I want you to understand realism, at least in this particular understanding of that word, does not refer to what we might think of as naturalism. Right? It's not that realism was an artistic movement that was trying to make images that look very realistic, that look realistic to nature. Realism in the 19th century is this artistic movement that begins in France, that rejected the academic approach of neoclassicism and the exaggerated emotions of romanticism. They say, both of you have it wrong. The realists instead advocated the philosophy that ordinary people and ordinary activities are worthy subjects for art. All right? That's kind of realism in a nutshell. That neoclassicism is too brainy and romanticism is too caught up in being overly emotional, that realism says, why can't we meet somewhere in the middle and focus on the ordinary and the everyday? Right? Then modern art. We're going to get into the beginnings, the very earliest beginnings of what's known as modern art. And these are artistic works produced during the period extending roughly from the 1860s to the 1970s, and denotes the style and philosophy of art in which the traditions of the past have been thrown aside in the spirit of experimentation. It may seem weird to say that a movement that we call modern art has already passed, but it is. It's been going for a good 40 some odd years. The modern art movement was about 100 years, about a century of Western art that was really hung up on throwing away all of the old rules of art and experimenting and breaking free, that kind of thing. And a term that you're going to hear me say later in this lecture, appropriation. And it's important that we go ahead and define it now, although it's going to pop up now and then kind of disappear for a number of decades before it comes back. Appropriation. This is an artistic concept in which an artist uses an image that's already in existence and places it in a new context in order to give it new meanings. We'll see an artist who's going to do that today, and so it's important that we understand what that word means. All right, so we're in the mid-19th century in France, and by the middle of the 19th century, the French monarchy had been restored after the defeat of Napoleon. But the new monarchy was found to be just as corrupt as the French, as Napoleon rather, and so the French became very disenfranchised as a result of all this political and economical inequality that was happening in France at the time. Therefore, a second French Revolution was launched. And this time around, socialism was promoted by many as a possible form of government that would remove socioeconomic classes. I mean, that was the hope, right? To finally get rid of classism, right, in France. At this time, both neoclassicism and romanticism were the officially recognized styles of the Academy. So, other artists rarely were allowed to show in the salon. Other artists being those who wanted to paint in other styles. So there are a lot of artists who were upset by social injustices around them, or who just simply wanted to incorporate subjects other than the sanctioned ones. Right? These artists, therefore, created works that directly subverted the academic rules, quote unquote, of art, and began setting up their own exhibitions that were independent of the salon. Around about this time, a group of artists formed called the Realists. That was a term that we looked at earlier, who felt that neoclassicism was too cold and calculated, and romanticism was just too overly dramatic to reflect the nature of what was the modern world. And remember, for these artists and for people living in this time in the Western world, but particularly for us in France, the modern world was moving faster than it ever had before. Now granted, it was still a snail's pace in comparison to how things move now, right, as we live in this age of information. But understand, at the time, right, the Industrial Revolution has happened. Trains are a thing. Automation of creating goods is starting to happen. And so suddenly life has a much faster pace to it. Things move more quickly than they have before, as well as modern life is much more centered around leisure, especially this new upper middle class, the bourgeois, as they're referred to in France. They, in particular, have a lot more leisure time on their hands. And if, say, you live in Paris, France, and you want to jump on a train and go all the way to the coast and enjoy some time on the coast or the Riviera or something like that, you have now, because of trains, you have the ability to do that. Go there, spend some time for the day, and hop on a train and come back. That kind of stuff couldn't have been done before this time. Modern life is faster. Those who are living in it see it as breaking away from the past, and they feel like the overly dramatic emotionality of romanticism and its complete opposite, the too cold and calculated nature of neoclassicism, don't accurately reflect what it is like to live in the modern world. So if we're going to talk about realism, how do we recognize it? What are the characteristics that we're looking for? Well, many of the realists continued the romantic tradition of loose painterly brushwork. Think back to some of those painters that we talked about during the Romantic era. Goya as a particularly good example, but also Eugene Delacroix. Right? They're more loose brushwork. However, they may have continued that, but they rejected that drama and the strong emotions of romanticism. That felt overly sentimental to them. The subject matter of realism is usually just everyday people and everyday scenarios, the people and things that these artists would have seen around them every day. Realists often use a darker palette than the romantics as well. And I want to go back real quickly to point number 3. It doesn't seem so odd to us living in the 21st century, the idea that one could paint depictions of just the people and places around them on a regular basis, and that is for that to be considered art is not a strange idea to us at all, right? But again, remember those salon rules. Those salon rules, which we'll remind ourselves of in a moment, they didn't allow a lot of room for that kind of thing. Some realists, not all, but some of them include these thinly veiled subversive attacks that are aimed at the establishments of academic art and the bourgeois. Again, remember that the bourgeois is the new upper middle class who have come to power, if you will, in France, and they have certain tastes, right? That these artists are going to very directly, well, I won't say very directly, very subversively rather, attack in their work. So let's look at some French realism, specifically how realism approaches painting what they see as contemporary social conditions. Right? They see art as ignoring social injustices, social classism, things of that nature, that the art of the elite is purely for the elite and is therefore ignoring the little guy. So you get someone like Jean-Francois Millet, who does these paintings. These are two that we'll look at as examples of his work, The Gleaners and The Sower, where Millet is giving us these images of people who would have been peasant class. Right? These are not the bourgeois. These people are not royalty. These people do not have any power in the class system of France. But look at how he has chosen to present them. Right? The peasant class, for the most part, neoclassicism would not have represented them at all. Right? Neoclassicism is all about the heroic figures and the morality stories and the history paintings, things of that nature. Right? You're rarely going to see someone who's from the peasant class. The romantics, they might have included the peasant class in some of their work, sure. They certainly would have included less wealthy peoples from the Near East and areas of that nature. But they would have romanticized them, right? They would have treated the people of the peasant class as pastoral, as if their life connected to nature is this beautiful thing. And wouldn't it be great if we could all get back to what the peasants understand about life, right? Does Millet do that? No, not even close. Millet instead shows us the hard, back-breaking work, while also showing us the dignity of these people. Right? The gleaners, these three women that are being referred to as the gleaners, are women, again, of the peasant class who, after a field, in this case a field of grain, has been harvested, as you can see in the background with the horses that are pulling a cart that's just laden with all of the probably wheat that was harvested from this field, they go out and painstakingly, bent over to the ground as they walk, pick up the gleanings of what's left of the grain on the ground to use for their own purposes, bread, food, what have you. And then, well, let me talk about how they're treated, right? So they're not romanticized. This is hard, backbreaking work that we're being shown, but they are dignified, right? They're not shown as sort of emotional creatures of bucolic beauty to be admired in a romantic sense, nor are they being shown as ignorant or incapable of being, or unworthy rather, of being respected, unable to be seen as moral creatures. He's trying to combine the two into this piece that is a realistic depiction of the plight of these people, a realistic depiction of how tough and difficult their lives are. And similarly with the sower here, where again, it's just an everyday peasant man who is sowing his field, throwing out seed into the field to grow and harvest. He's not wealthy. He's dressed very poorly. His clothes are in tatters. But look at how he's presented. He nearly fills the frame of the painting, right? He is given the sort of dramatic weight that the neoclassicists would have given the heroic male figure, right? But instead of that heroic male figure, we're giving a man who is simply doing a job, doing a hard sweat, blood and tears job of sewing. And that should be perfectly allowable to be presented in art. That's the argument that Millet is making. Another realist of the time is Gustave Courbet. Gustave Courbet, he was a French painter who led the Realism movement. He was sort of the de facto leader of the whole thing. He rejected academic conventions and romantic emotion. Of course he did. And he painted these unidealized peasant figures living hard lives. So similar to Millet. We'll see where the difference is in a moment. But Millet, he's in those paintings, he is sort of teetering ever so slightly on romanticism with those paintings that he did, and Courbet is going to completely go away from that. No romanticism at all. He painted these unidealized peasant figures at a very grand scale, the type of scale that the Academy reserved only for history paintings. We'll look at that in a second as well. And he was this lifelong socialist. He felt that the government and the societal constructs of France should be overthrown and become socialist. He was actually even involved in a very short-lived coup that took over, of all things, Paris, France, and for a brief moment put a socialist government in place in Paris, and he was a part of the attack that was led to do that. This is probably one of his most famous paintings, The Stonebreakers from 1849, that was sadly destroyed in 1945 during World War II. This is Courbet. This is Courbet giving us no romanticism whatsoever, no neoclassicism whatsoever. And in these paintings that he would do, he's also really thumbing his nose at the Academy and those who would try to impose rules on art. Because again, he sees that as being connected with the upper classes, the upper middle class, the aristocracy, royalty, those who would hold down the lower classes. He sees these ideas of attaching rules to art as being elitist. So what does he give us instead? A very simple image of a man and a younger boy, or at least young man, doing a back-breaking job, right? Taking larger rocks and breaking them down into smaller rocks that can be used for construction, that can be used for roads, what have you, right? A job that the upper middle class, the bourgeois, and the aristocracy, and everybody in the upper crust of society depends upon what these people do in their everyday lives. And they're doing hard work, kneeling down in the rocks, breaking the rocks, right? The work that everyone depends upon. But are they wealthy? Definitely not. You look at their tattered clothing. The boy on the left who's got a hole so big in his shirt we can see through to the skin. The vest of the gentleman on the right that's been torn so that we can see through to the shirt. Everything is threadbare and falling apart. These are not wealthy people. They're not making a living that puts them on the same level as the bourgeois doing this hard work, right? But again, this painting, if you were to ever see it, well, if you could see it in real life, was huge. It was gigantic, the size of what the Academy said, was only reserved for history painting. So, taking this extremely large size and then taking our two main figures, who are everything that we've just said that they are, and increasing or making them almost fill the space, they become these monumental figures, is saying that this man and boy, in their peasant state of life, is just as important and is just as worthy of being in art and is just as worthy of being praised as the history paintings of neoclassicism and romanticism. So just want to remind you real quickly, right, the hierarchy of genre, and ergo the rules that the Academy had put in place at this time. And at the top, very top of that hierarchy is history painting. Right? Each of these genres, recall, have their own rules. Even to the point of landscape painting, which is down there at number 4. Granted, it doesn't mention the rules here, but one of the rules is that if you wanted to paint in landscape, there was this rule that you had to paint a landscape very specifically must be blue at the top, green in the middle, and brown at the bottom. Right? And if you broke out from those rules, then you might not be able to make it into the Academy. History paintings, again at the very top, were meant to be large paintings. They were meant to represent just how skillful the trained artist was. They were meant to tell stories of great heroism or some historical event. Or you would call it even the romantic painters like Jericho were making history paintings. Jericho making that painting of the Wrath of the Medusa, right? That was meant to be the story of human triumph, not human triumph so much, but it was meant to be a story connected to the human condition, let's say. It was romantic in its emotional overtones, but it was still a history painting. That painting was on a really large scale as well. But what Gustave Courbet does with that same extremely large scale is something like this, the Burial at Ornans, that he painted between 1849 and 1850. This painting, again, is huge. Each of the human beings within it is life-size, if not a little larger. This is a huge, giant painting. And what is it? Well, just as the title would suggest, Burial at Ornans, it is a funeral. We're looking at a funeral procession, not, again, of the bourgeois, but of the either lower middle class, maybe. I don't necessarily see the peasantry here, but we are looking at a lower class. These are not people who are held to the same standard, if you will, as the bourgeois. These are not bourgeois people. They're everyday people. This is what Courbet is interested in painting. You see again this group of people who are all just regular, everyday, ordinary people, unromanticized, unidealized, right? But again, painted at this extremely grand scale to put these everyday, ordinary, insignificant, one might even try to say, one might say these insignificant people, taking them and putting them at that scale, equating them with the historical figures of the neoclassical history paintings. Suggests these people are important. They are important. They should be looked at. And this little simple moment of people grieving is just as important as the big, giant historical stories or the big emotion-filled narratives of Romanticism. And just in case we're missing the point anyway as we're looking at this, in the foreground we have the actual grave that has been dug, and there are two things happening there that hit the point home. One is that skull that you can see there to the right of the hole of the grave, right? That skull is there because very often the people of the lower classes, when needing to bury their dead, might have to bury their dead in a grave that might be shared with someone who died long before, right? Because burial plots are expensive. And clearly, when this grave was dug for whomever has been buried there was someone already there. That skull has been tossed to the side for the moment. But then also, again, remember this painting is gigantic and huge. And if you were to ever actually stand in front of it, and you stand dead center in the middle of this painting to look at it, you are down there at eye level as if you are in that grave yourself looking at this whole thing. Even if you are wealthy, if you're looking at this painting, you're down in that grave, looking up at these people who are grieving. If you're a peasant and you're looking at this painting, you're down in that grave looking at these people. It's a reminder that we're all going to die. We're all going to die. It doesn't matter how rich, how wealthy, how poor, what social standing you have, whether people like you or don't like you, whether you're an outcast. We're all going to die. And that's the reminder that he wants to give us, right? It's very, very realist and very socialist ideas. Then, as I mentioned, there were some realists who are going to include in their work these assaults, these sort of thinly veiled assaults on academic values, the Academy that has the salons in Paris, and bourgeois taste, what the tastes and desires of those who are in the upper middle class. Chief among them would be Edouard Manet. Edouard Manet, born in 1832 and died in 1883. He was a French painter, of course, who was a pivotal figure in the transition from realism to what we'll talk about in the next lesson, Impressionism. He kind of gets lumped into both, but he's a realist, really, first and foremost. His early paintings Well, early on, he actually was trying to get into the salon. And once he kind of gives up on the salon, he starts making these paintings that use appropriation, that term that I talked about before, where we take sort of pre-existing imagery and change it in some way to give it new meanings. He's using that to subvert the conventions of the salon and to make a commentary on these very draconian academic rules. In 1863, he makes these two paintings that we're going to take a look at, Luncheon on the Grass and Olympia. And what I'm about to say is something so important that if I were in your shoes, I would write it down. It very well could be a quiz question. These two paintings, Luncheon on the Grass and Olympia, are considered by art historians as the first modernist paintings. So let's look at them and let's talk about why. This is Luncheon on the Grass from Edward Manet in 1863. This is the first of these two paintings that he produced in 1863 that got him a lot of attention. So these paintings were put on display. The art-going public was scandalized by them. This one, in fact, people literally tried to jump out and attack it with their umbrellas and poke holes in it, right? They were infuriated by what they were seeing. But why? What's so revolutionary about what we're looking at here? What is there to get angry about? Well, there's a few things. The first, before I even get into the figures, I want us to look at the surroundings of these individuals, right? The world that they are populating. It seems to be a natural setting, right? There are trees, there's water in the background. We can sort of see sky peeking through the trees. But look at it. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you really start to pay attention to it. And what do I mean? Well, there's this tree that we can see over here to the left. Of the two trees that we can see to the left, it would be the one that's closest to us. All right? That tree looks way too short to be as close as it appears to be to our figures who are sitting here in the foreground. And then you look at the way that the painting has been executed as we move into the background, and the way that that's been done back there, this doesn't feel supernaturalistic. It certainly doesn't conform to Renaissance-era ideas of perspective, right? It almost feels like everything that is behind these individuals who are in the immediate foreground, it's like it was a drop, like a backdrop that's just been pulled down behind them, right? It looks flat. It doesn't look like there's deep space there. It looks very flat, and the space that makes the space weird and confusing, as well as there's that loose brushwork that he is applying back there that he doesn't seem to be applying to the figures who are in the foreground, these two men and this woman. That already in and of itself was upsetting some people. He was breaking all these rules, right? Those are rules that he's breaking by not sticking to traditional ideas of Renaissance perspective and space to make things that are further away look further away, and things that are closer look closer, things of that nature. He's rejecting that. He's making a painting that looks much more flat. He's accentuating the fact that this is not a group of people sitting in a field, right, or in the woods. That's not what this is at all, right? It's paint on a canvas. That is what we have in front of us. It is an object. It is not the things that we would try to ascribe to it. It's not a woman. That woman's not really sitting there. That man's not really sitting next to her. There's not a woman in the background. There are not trees. This is all oil paint that's been applied to canvas, pure and simple. And he's showing that off. In addition, this painting is an example of what we were talking about before, of appropriation. All right? This painting here by Georgion and Ortician, the attribution is often argued over. This is a painting titled Pastoral Concert. And this is completely what Manet is ripping off. Right? He is looking at this painting and he is completely and utterly ripping it off. Why? Well, he's saying, all right, French art establishment, academic rules. What you keep telling me is that I should look to the past. I should look to the Renaissance because that was the time when art was at its height, and I should paint like them. Well, okay, fine. I'm literally going to paint like them. I'm going to give you the exact same damn thing. Can I get into the salon now, please? Right? But he changed it. Again, there was that playing that he's doing with the space, right? But he also did another thing. Instead of this sort of like faraway kind of mythical nature to the figures that are in the painting, right? These figures, because of the way they're dressed, because of the women who are sitting with them, who are not not dressed necessarily, this feels fairy tale to a certain extent. Instead, he made them dressed like modern day human beings in 1863 would have been dressed, except for the women. Now, in this scenario, this painting from the Renaissance, for some reason, we don't question why there are a couple of nude women who are sitting with these two gentlemen, right? Put them in modern day clothing, and suddenly, especially in the Victorian era, when social norms said that a woman should suppress her sexuality, that woman looks like a harlot. She looks like she is, how shameful, what is she doing? Hanging out with these men in no clothing whatsoever, just completely and utterly nude. For these men who are just sitting there, who can see it all, right? That that kind of thing. He's doing that. He is being the snarkiest asshole ever. He is totally trying to attack both the Academy by saying, look, oh yeah, if you want me to paint like Titian, all right, fine. I will literally paint what Titian painted. But he's also attacking the bourgeois and their ideas about male and the roles of men and women, male and female roles in society by again, taking something that we've already seen, we already know that everybody should be familiar with, and by just changing it into modern times, turning it into this thing that the bourgeois is going to look at and see as being shameful. This they see as the height of moral art, and this they see as shameful, as pornography. And he does something similar with this painting, also done in it says 1865 there, it should say 1863. My apologies. This is a painting titled Olympia. And again, it's a complete and utter ripoff of a Renaissance painting, in this case Titian's Venus of Urbino from 1538. Right? He has stolen the composition. Right? We have a female figure who is lying down, who is mostly nude, and is lying down in very similar pose in both. He has stolen the bed that she's laying on, right, with the white pillows and the white drapery, and the red color of the actual mattress that is peeking through. He even stole that green curtain that we can sort of see in the upper left corner of both. Then he gives us in both cases a servant, although there's some changes there that we'll talk about in a moment. And in both cases, he gave us a small animal, a pet, down at the foot of the bed. All right, so again, this is total and utter snark as he is trying to thumb his nose at the Academy by saying again, all right, you want me to paint like the old masters of the Renaissance? Well, here you go, bam, there it is. I have given you a Titian. It's the same damn painting. Why can't I get into the salon now? But it's not the same painting, is it? He made some very intentional changes. For one, we were just talking about the servant. Instead of the two servants who are off in the background, and both of whom are who appear to be white Europeans, in the foreground he has given us a servant who seems to be of African descent, and she's much closer to us. And whereas the servants on the Venus of Urbino seem to be gathering up clothes for the woman in the foreground to wear, this lady in Olympia is holding a bouquet of flowers. Then the animal at the end of the bed has been changed. In the Venus of Urbino, it's a cute little sleeping puppy. In Olympia, it's a black cat with its back arched, looking at us and hissing at us. That cat is not happy that we're here. That dog over there has fallen asleep and does not care that we're around, right? There's some changes with Olympia herself. Those changes I think I'll dive into in just a sec rather than bringing them up right now. But one of the biggest things is that if it wasn't as clear to you in the last painting that the Renaissance sense of perspective and space within a painting was being ignored, look at it now. You can definitely see it. Because Titian is over here thinking about perspective. He wants that really deep sense of that space going back into the painting there to the right. Over here in Manet's painting, everything is flat. Right? Again, the background behind the figures looks like it could just be a backdrop that was just pulled down behind them. Even the bed itself has been painted in such a way, in very quick strokes, and without a lot of attention to sort of deep dark shadows and the folds of the fabric, that even the bed kind of feels flat. It feels like Olympia could just slide off this thing, right? As if in some places the bed looks like it's there and it's three-dimensional, and in some places it just looks like a collection of brush strokes. And again, that's Manet pointing out and showcasing the fact that what we're looking at is not a woman in a particular setting in any sort of real sense of depth or space. It's paint on a canvas. It's an object, a thing, right? Now, let's get back to Olympia herself. Olympia looks very different from Venus over here for a number of reasons. One, her skin is this, I don't know, kind of icky pallor, right? It doesn't have the sort of warmth and the sense of blood pumping through it that the Venus of Urbino has over there. Her skin's an off color. Secondly, she looks us directly in the eye, whereas Venus does not. Venus, well, she's kind of looking at us, but she's also got her head tilted ever so slightly. She's giving us this, hey, come hither kind of look, right? Whoever we, the observer, are in Venus of Urbino, Venus is clearly making herself sexually available to us. We are being invited to stare. And if you look at her hand, what would be her left hand, it's on our right side, that's sort of, let's just say, covering the sweet spot, if you will. Right? Look how just limply that hand is hanging. She's barely got any control over it. If we wanted, we could totally just reach over there, grab her wrist, and just lift her hand away and have our eyes feast upon that sweet spot, if you will. Right? Go over here to Olympia, and what does Olympia have going on? That hand is not limp. That hand is firmly planted, hard, and with force. Right? You are not going to get to that unless she says so. Right? Olympia has the say over who gets access to that sweet spot, if you will. Not so much Venus over here. Venus, completely and utterly stare, take a look all you want. Why don't you come on over here? Olympia is looking at us directly as an equal. what we see over here in Olympia is a prostitute, a sex worker, who is looking at us, whoever the observer is. We seem to be the next customer. She is looking at us like it's a business transaction. She sees us as an equal. And her servant has brought in a bunch of flowers that are no doubt a present from some other, maybe the last customer who's come in, right? And it's this way of Manet pointing out that, look, we romanticize what Titian did over here, and we see this woman who's laid out and put on display for our male eyes to look upon and desire and want. But we somehow romanticize her in that is somehow fairy tale, mythic. But if I make it modern and in the day in which we live, she's suddenly a prostitute. Maybe she was in Titian's painting too. Who knows? But no doubt about it in the Olympia painting, the one that Manet has painted for us. Those changes are ways, again, of thumbing his nose at and rejecting the salon ideas and the ideas of the bourgeois and how they think men and women should position themselves in society, what they sort of see as the natural roles of men and women. Lastly, we'll look at Edgar Degas. Edgar Degas, born in 1834 and died in 1917. He was a French artist. He was a painter, a sculptor, a printmaker, a draftsperson. He even worked a little bit in photography. This guy was doing it all. He was a self-avowed realist, but he often gets, again, labeled as one of the founding members of Impressionism, the movement that we'll get to in the next lesson. And he's particularly known for applying academic techniques. Right? He had academic training to be an artist. And he would take those techniques and apply them to observations of everyday life rather than big, emotion-filled things, what have you, right? He would make depictions of modern people doing modern things and paintings of people who were on the margins of society that were, for the most part, included not worthy of inclusion in art. Like the absinthe drinker here. The absinthe drinker, painted in 1875-76, which is very simply a couple of people hanging out in a bar, perhaps a little drunk. But he takes his academic training. All right, we can see his painting being very similar, his application of painting very similar to the Romantics. He's organizing his composition in a way that would have been taught in the academy, but is applying it to just a simple painting of some people hanging out. And he would also do this weird, awkward cropping of the compositions. Like, notice how he's kind of crammed our main focused characters up into the upper right. And he even has the gentleman here on the right completely cut off, right? His hand and pipe and things are off the canvas. He would do this awkward cropping as a way of sort of, again, showcasing modern life, the way that we just sort of walk in and take a quick look at the things that we encounter. Right? Also as a way of sort of rejecting how the salon would suggest that you should compose your paintings. Like this one, the rehearsal, which is very simply a ballet rehearsal, which, by the way, at this particular moment in time, the ballet was not considered the high art that is considered now, right? It was considered by a lot of people at the time to be a lowly pursuit on the level of like burlesque. So he's painting people who are marginalized. And look, easily, a full third of this painting is just the floor. That weird, strange cropping that he has brought into it. All right, so that does it for realism. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at Impressionism and the artists who made that happen.